Is a very modest young man. He gave me very little information about himself to introduce him. So I looked on the back flap of my book and I found out a little bit of information. So I'll tell you a little bit about Justin Martin. He is the author of two highly praised biographies. One about Alan Greenspan called Greenspan, the Man Behind Money. And the other is called Nader, Crusader, Spoiler, Icon. As one of the few journalists to gain access to Greenspan, Martin produced a best-selling biography of the secretive Fed chairman, selected as a notable book for 2001 by the New York Times Book Review. Martin Nader's biography served as a primary source for An Unreasonable Man, an Academy Award-nominated documentary. Martin's articles have appeared in a variety of publications, including Fortune, Newsweek, and the San Francisco Chronicle. He lives with his wife and twin sons in Forest Hills Gardens, New York, a neighborhood designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. I think it would be interesting to hear a little bit about Frederick Law Olmsted's son. And on the back of this cover, Candace Millard, author of The River of Doubt, Theodore Roosevelt's Darkest Journey, in a quote, says, "It would be difficult to find a figure in American history who has left as indelible an imprint on the national landscape as Frederick Law Olmsted. In this rigorously researched, compellingly written biography, Martin leaves no stone unturned as he brings this iconic man to life, triumphs, tragedies, and all." Please welcome Justin Martin.
So let me know if there's any problem hearing me at the outset here. Thank you for that very nice introduction. It's really an honor to be here at the. Can everybody hear me all right, by the way? Yeah.
There we go.
That should be good. Okay. Well, good. Thanks again for the very nice introduction, Connie. And it's really an honor to be here at the Winchester Senior Center, at the Jenks Center. And my speech today is called "The Accidental Renaissance Man Comes to Boston." And that's a mouthful. So I thought the easiest thing to do is to kind of break my speech up into a couple different parts. First, I'm going to describe just an absolutely circuitous route that Olmsted took to being a landscape architect. Then I'm going to describe his absolutely wonderful plans for parks in Boston. And then in the context of that, I'll describe how all of the various career eddies and dead ends that he traveled down, how they came into play, and how this wealth of experience really informed the Boston parks and made them so special and so set apart. And then there'll certainly be time for questions. Now, Frederick Law Olmsted was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1822. He was born into a pretty prosperous family. His father was a dry goods merchant. And as was to happen in that era, particularly in pretty prosperous families, Olmsted was sent away for his schooling. He entered into a whole series of arrangements with very poor country parsons. These parsons, they were besieged and beset. They had their parsonage duties. Many of them were running small farms on the side to earn extra income. That left them very little time and very little focus for their third role, which is acting as educators. Olmsted was very mischievous as a boy. So he's in the habit of sneaking out of these parsonages, wandering around, setting traps for quail, fishing, got very little schooling. He certainly developed an appreciation for landscape, particularly the landscape of his native Connecticut. Now, when Olmsted was 14 years old, he developed a very severe case of poison sumac, and it spread into his eyes. And at this point, Olmsted contrived to get a letter from a doctor indicating that he no longer needed to go to school. He was delighted. But this also meant that at a very young age, 14, he had to go out and find some kind of useful profession. And the first thing he hit upon is kind of logical and kind of deeply illogical. He decided he wanted to become a surveyor. And surveying was certainly a profession, in this era at least, that was available to someone with limited formal schooling. But surveying also requires eagle-sharp eyesight. And Olmsted just had this bout of poison sumac that spread into his eyes. But never mind, Olmsted pressed ahead, he landed a internship or an apprenticeship with a man who was a surveyor. And then while pretending to learn this useful trade, Olmsted just abused the situation. He wandered around, hiking, fishing, paddling in his canoe. He learned almost nothing about surveying, but he really deepened his appreciation for landscape, particularly landscape as a native Connecticut. Now about this time, his father decided, time for Olmsted to get serious, time for him to settle down. So his father arranged for Olmsted to move to Brooklyn, and through connections that his father had, he got Olmsted a job working for an importing firm in Manhattan. Now Olmsted was deeply lonely in Brooklyn, and he hated this job with the importing firm. He hated the long hours, he hated the regimentation, he hated the fact that he was chained to a desk. Really, there was only one thing about the job that he liked. That was periodically he was called upon to go on board of ships that were docked in New York Harbor to inventory their wares. It was while doing this, Olmsted hit upon a new possible direction. He decided he wanted to become a sailor. Now, sailing certainly made sense. This was a profession that was available, in this era at least, to someone with pretty limited formal schooling. And Olmsted came out of this desire honestly. You go back through the generations, and Olmsted after Olmsted had gone to sea. So in April of 1843, Olmsted set off from Manhattan Harbor, headed for China, on board a ship called the Ronaldson. And on July 4th of 1843, as the Ronaldson rounded the Cape of Good Hope, right beneath the southern tip of Africa, it encountered an absolutely ferocious snowstorm. Now the Ronaldson was traveling through the southern hemisphere. Weather patterns can be reversed, so it's possible on July 4th to have some pretty severe winter weather. This storm was incredible. Olmsted took a look around at his fellow sailors, many of whom were pretty seasoned. He could see panic in their eyes. He realized this ship really might sink. About this time, Captain Fox, the captain of the Ronaldson, gave the order to furl sail. What this meant was the Ronaldson had become uncontrollable. The sails were actually acting as a detriment. It made more sense to just roll them up. So Olmsted and his fellow crewmen, they furled sail, and then Olmsted and his fellow crewmen, they went below deck, and for 3 days and 3 nights, they just huddled there while the Ronaldson was tossed on the ocean almost like a cork, completely unmanned, completely uncontrollable. Olmsted expected at any moment that the ship would split open, he'd be pitched into the icy sea and a certain death. Fortunately, that did not happen. Olmsted continued on to China. He dropped off, the Ronaldson dropped off its load of American goods. It picked up a load of Chinese tea and started back towards the United States. Along the way, Olmsted had all kinds of privations. He didn't get enough sleep, he didn't get enough water, he didn't get enough food. He watched as his fellow sailors were whipped for even the minorest of infractions. And when the Ronaldson docked in April of 1844 in New York Harbor, when Olmsted disembarked on the dry land, he vowed never, never to go to sea again. But this only meant that Olmsted needed to find a new profession. And so now it occurred to him he decided to become a farmer. And once again, this made perfect sense. I mean, farming was one of the few professions, or one of the professions that was available in this era to someone who had pretty limited formal schooling. And farming was also, it was the profession. It was 70% of the population was occupied in farming. And Olmsted decided he didn't want to just become a farmer. He wanted to become a scientific farmer. He was having the very first pangs of the desire to enact some kind of social reform, to become a social reformer. And scientific farming struck him as a way to accomplish this. And I'll explain. Olmsted certainly didn't get much schooling, but he was extremely well read. And what he concluded he was going to do is he was going to read the latest agricultural journals. He would glean the latest cutting-edge farming practices, and he would disseminate this information to his fellow farmers, many of whom were illiterate. And in this way, he could act as a kind of social reformer. So Olmsted identified a man who had received a commendation for running a model scientific farm. He arranged to serve an apprenticeship under this man. And when the apprenticeship was over, Olmsted started his life as a farmer. And true to his word, he really was good at this. He really was good at raising crops. And true to his word, he also really did act as a social reformer. He really was disseminating information about scientific farming and cutting-edge practices to his fellow farmers. But then Olmsted learned that his younger brother John was getting ready to take a walking tour across England. And Olmsted became almost pathologically jealous. He could not believe that his younger brother was setting off on this great adventure while he was stuck on the farm. So he started writing a series of letters to his father, begging to be allowed to go along. Now, you might wonder why a man, now in his mid-20s, would have to beg his father's permission. Well, his father held the mortgage to the farm. But his father was also a very kind, very generous man, particularly by 19th century fatherly standards. So his father agreed to let Olmsted go along on this trip with his brother. He further agreed to stake Olmsted to some money to take this tour. Now, when Olmsted returned, he was the beneficiary of a very fortunate coincidence. Olmsted was farming on Staten Island at this point. And Staten Island, it wasn't yet part of New York City. It was simply an island off the tip of Manhattan. And one of Olmsted's neighbors was a weekend hobby farmer named George Putnam. Now, that name might have some resonance to people in the audience today. Putnam was he was the founder of a publishing company, which is still with us, Putnam's. And he was in the habit of, he'd work in Manhattan all week, Putnam would, and he'd come out on the weekends, he'd putter around his hobby farm. And Putnam was a real innovator. He was one of the very first people that published paperback books. He was publishing all different kinds of books. He was publishing treatises on philosophy, collections of poetry, collections of short fiction, and he was selling them for 25 cents a pop. So Putnam approached Olmsted, his neighboring farmer on Staten Island, and he asked Olmsted whether he'd be willing to produce an account to be published in paperback of his recent walking tour across England. Olmsted readily agreed, and he wrote a book called Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. Now, reviews were tepid. Sales were extremely slow. But Olmsted had now made an incredible transition. He'd gone from being a surveyor to a clerk to a sailor to a farmer to a writer. And now comes an absolutely extraordinary coincidence. This was the early 1850s, and it was a brand new newspaper called the New York Daily Times. A few years hence, it would drop the daily and become merely the New York Times. And this paper was in a competitive fight for its life. This was the time when there were about a dozen dailies in any large American city. Now, Henry Raymond, the editor of this new paper, the New York Times, he wanted to figure out a way to separate his newspaper from the large field of competition. He came to the conclusion that the best way to set the Times apart was veracity. And this was the era of yellow journalism, and a dozen or so other papers in New York were in the habit of stretching the truth mightily or just making things up whole cloth. So Raymond concluded that if the New York Times devoted itself to objective reporting, insofar as that's possible, it would be possible to kind of separate it from its field of competitors. Raymond was also committed to covering some of the big stories of the day. And one of the biggest stories at that time was, this was the early 1850s, and tensions that existed between the northern and southern regions of the United States. Tensions rooted in the institution of slavery that had existed from the very inception of the nation. They were once again at one of their periodic flashpoints. They looked like there might be civil war, they looked like there might be violence, there might even be out-and-out civil war. So Raymond, the editor of the Times, decided he wanted to dispatch a reporter who would travel across the South and treat the region almost as if this reporter was a foreign correspondent. Now, Olmsted applied for this job. He had a 5-minute interview with Henry Raymond, and he was handed this absolutely dream assignment. Now, you might think he sounds pretty underqualified, but he did have a writing credit. He'd written this book, Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. More importantly, Olmsted was a farmer, and the South in this era was nothing if not an agrarian society. So in the autumn of 1852, after the harvest was over, because Olmsted was still a farmer by trade, he set off for the South. And the only way to describe it is nothing could have prepared Henry Raymond. Nothing could have prepared anyone for what an able reporter he turned out to be. He went everywhere, he talked to everyone. He talked to slaves, he talked to plantation owners, he talked to poor white farmers. They produced a spectacular series of dispatches that helped put the brand new New York Times on the map. In 1861, Olmsted's dispatches were collected in a volume called Cotton Kingdom. Here it is, exactly 150 years later. The Cotton Kingdom is still in print. And I can tell you, if you want to get a window into the South on the eve of the Civil War, you can watch the movie Gone with the Wind. It's fictional, but it certainly provides a lot of useful and telling insights about the South and the antebellum period, or you can read Olmsted's absolutely spectacular dispatches collected in the Cotton Kingdom. So Olmsted had now made a transition into what he called the literary republic, and next he landed another really plum assignment. He became an editor at a magazine called Putnam's. And Putnam's was a competitor of a brand new magazine called Harper's. And Putnam's had just an amazing stable of writers. It was publishing Emerson, Thoreau, Longfellow. While working at Putnam's, Olmsted copy-edited a couple of short stories by Herman Melville. But then comes an absolute cataclysmic event in U.S. economic history. It's come to be known as the Panic of 1857. It's a very rapid downward spiral of economic conditions. Putnam's, the magazine Olmsted was working for, went belly up. Olmsted found himself without a job. He was low on coal. He had a hole in his hat. He didn't have proper shoes, and he owed money to just about everyone he knew. So he took a job that was just an incredible come down. It was an extremely modest job for someone who had recently been rubbing shoulders with the likes of Emerson and Melville. He took a very modest job, which he was called upon to knock down shanties and drain swamps to clear a very scruffy piece of land that was prosaically named for its position right in the middle of New York City. It was called Central Park, and Olmsted's job was simply to clear this piece of land for someone else's design. Enter Calvert Vaux. Now, Vaux was an English-trained architect. He took one look at the existing design for Central Park, and he was disgusted. He could not believe how amateurish it was. And Vaux had friends in high places. He'd recently designed the Fifth Avenue mansion of one of the board members of the future Central Park. So Vaux started approaching the board and saying, first of all, the existing design is really amateurish. And secondly, in England, where I'm from, Vaux said, if you want to get the best design, hold a public design competition. Well, the board had listened to Vaux, it tabled the existing design for Central Park, and it announced a public competition soliciting new designs for the park. At this point, Vaux sought out Olmsted to see if Olmsted wanted to be partners for the design competition. Now, Vaux, he couldn't care a whit about the fact that Olmsted had lately been traveling in these lofty circles, rubbing shoulders with Emerson and Thoreau. This meant nothing to Vaux in this context. The reason Vaux wanted to be partners with Olmsted was because Olmsted had been out on this scruffy piece of land, knocking down shanties and draining swamps. And Vaux perceived that if he and Olmsted teamed up together, that they'd have a leg up in the competition because Olmsted literally knew the lay of the land. So they partnered up, and the only way to describe it is it's kind of parallel to Olmsted's earlier reporting for the New York Times. Nothing could have prepared Vaux. Nothing could have prepared anyone for what brilliant ideas Olmsted brought to this new endeavor. There were 33 different contestants in the public contest for Central Park. 32 of them produced plans that rate somewhere between a B- and a flat F. Olmsted and Vaux produced an A+. It was instantly recognized as the design for Central Park. I'll give you just one example of one way in which their design was so very separate from the other designs. Many of the other 32 designers, many of the other 32 contestants, came up with what I like to call imperial parks. These were parks that were full of triumphal arches and elaborate fountainry. Olmsted and Vaux, by contrast, they came up with a much more rural, naturalistic design. And Olmsted and Vaux, along with the blueprint they designed for Central Park, they also came up with just voluminous, written, supporting material in which they argued why they made the choices they made. And they argued that a rural park had certain advantages over one of these imperial parks in the following way. They made the point that in an imperial park, a person could be walking underneath a triumphal arch, and that would serve as a constant reminder of that person's lowly station. Here you would be in the middle of a park trying to relax, but you have this archway that you'd be walking through, and it would be kind of a reminder of what large, unaccountable forces are shaping my life that I have no control over. They argue that a rural or naturalistic park would be a great antidote to this because people, as they went into this park, they would naturally shed their various class distinctions, which Olmsted and Vaux argued were artificial in any case. And people would mix and mingle in this kind of park, and it would become a kind of glorious democratic experiment. One of the arguments that Olmsted and Vaux summoned, and this will become a theme throughout Olmsted's career, was that nature itself is very democratic. No one owns nature, it belongs to everyone, and so a natural park would be a great backdrop, a great place to foster the free exchange of information, people coming together, exchanging ideas. And so finally, with park making, this profession that Olmsted just came to by accident, he finally found a worthy outlet for his desire to be some kind of social reformer. Now, Olmsted and Vaux, they were pretty far along with Central Park. They'd done most everything they wanted to do. What they hadn't done was planned when in 1861 the Civil War broke out. Now, given everything that Olmsted had seen while traveling through the South in the New York Times, he certainly wanted to be involved in the conflict, and he certainly wanted to be involved on the Union side. And so Olmsted went down to Washington. He headed up an outfit called the United States Sanitary Commission. This was a Civil War battlefield relief outfit that just provided immeasurable relief to wounded soldiers. After the Civil War, this very outfit that Olmsted founded, through a whole series of convolutions, morphed into the American Red Cross. But about halfway through the Civil War, Olmsted was always a very restless person, began to start casting about. He felt like he had the United States Sanitary Commission on solid footing, was up and running. He started looking around for some fresh challenge, something new to do. And it's kind of interesting, but Olmsted never even considered landscape, at this point, landscape architecture, the very profession that he and Vaux had pioneered. He had a masterpiece to his credit in Central Park, but he also had the perception that with a war on, there'd be very little interest in landscaping and parks and so forth. And so instead, at the tail end of the Civil War, Olmsted went out to California. He became the supervisor of a gold mine. Now, while working as a gold mine supervisor, Olmsted became absolutely enchanted with Yosemite Valley, which was about 30 miles away from his gold mine. He started visiting repeatedly, and according to one account at least, Olmsted was one of the very first 500 non-Native Americans to ever even visit Yosemite. That gives you an idea of how remote of a place it was in this era in the 1860s. And as Olmsted visited, he started to really get the feeling that it might be very remote now, but it's not long before civilization starts encroaching on this beautiful place. And so Olmsted started arguing for and making a call for the preservation of Yosemite. The fact that he was a journalist or had some journalistic training allowed him to have an outlet for this. He was able to write articles and make some speeches about preserving Yosemite. And his argument was that you couldn't look in private interest to preserve this beautiful natural place. You really needed to have a far-seeing, benevolent government step in and preserve this place for prosperity. Now, Olmsted's call for preserving Yosemite is so incredibly prescient when you consider this was the 1860s, almost a full 50 years before the National Park Service was even created. So the Civil War ended, and all of a sudden there started to be a boom, an economic boom in the north at least. And all of a sudden, all these cities started clamoring for landscape work and for parks. So Olmsted and Vaux, they reunited. They designed a whole series of different parks. They did Prospect Park. They did a park system for Buffalo. They designed Riverside, which is a suburban community right outside Chicago. Olmsted and Vaux never got along well. They're always at each other's throats. So pretty soon their partnership, or after a while, their partnership broke up. Olmsted continued on solo. He designed the grounds of the United States Capitol. He designed Montreal, which is a park in Montreal. So by 1878, when Olmsted first came to do work in Boston, he had so much experience. He had all the work that he'd done with Vaux on landscape architecture. He had all the work he'd done without Vaux. And then he had all of the various professions that he had worked in, all the various career eddies and dead ends that he traveled down to draw upon. And that's why his park work in Boston is so spectacular and so set apart, is because of all this wealth of experience that he had to draw upon. Now, the very first park that Olmsted was called upon to work on in Boston, and this was there was an existing Boston Park Commission, and they asked him to design a park in the Back Bay section of the city. And the place where they wanted him to design a park was actually a place which Bostonians had gotten into the habit of throwing their garbage and refuse. And so it had turned over time into a kind of fetid plain, almost like a swamp. And there was an existing plan for this park, and it was kind of like Central Park, an existing park plan existed. And Olmsted in this case, it was Olmsted in this case who thought this is very amateurish. It was simply an ornamental garden that can be superimposed onto the swamp. And Olmsted recognized this was a very naive plan. Olmsted also recognized he built gates that would communicate with the Charles River and make sure that the water level stayed on a kind of constant level in this new park. Once he had that under control, he came up with a planting scheme. And the planting scheme involved planting various salt-tolerant species, things like sea buckthorn and tamarinks, seeing what would stick. And those plants that did stick grew up and pretty soon turned this into something that looked like the salt marsh that it had once been. As a final step, Olmsted wanted to name his creation. As someone who was a journalist and or had been a journalist and had a way with words, he always considered naming something kind of a great final step in the process. Now, the Boston Park Commission, they wanted to call this the Back Bay Park. That made perfect sense. But Olmsted had a dictionary published in 1706 that he loved to page through and consult when he was trying to come up with suitably kind of old-fangled names for things. He came across the term fens. And fens is an archaic term for a boggy, marshy piece of land. And that was, of course, the name of this stuff, the Back Bay Fens. So Olmsted was well underway with his work on the Back Bay Fens when he was called upon to do by the Boston Park Commission to do a second park in Boston. And this one was very, very different from the first park. A very different park and a very different challenge. This time they wanted to create an arboretum that was also a public park. And this was kind of a challenge because an arboretum is a tree museum. It has to have a certain amount of scientific rigor to it. And of course, a public park is something for people to walk through and recreate and enjoy themselves. But Olmsted rose to the challenge. It was necessary in this era. There was something called the Bentham and Hooker model. It was a 19th century scientific classification for trees. It was arranging trees in the knowledge of the times according to their complexity. And so a tree like a magnolia is a particularly simple tree according to this scheme. A tree like a tulip, slightly more complicated. A tree like a linden, a particularly complicated tree. So it fell to Olmsted to try to come up with a really attractive pathway that would wind past these various trees arranged according to this very rigorous scientific order. And to add to the challenge, this was to be something kind of novel. It was to be a drive-through park. The idea was that people would visit the park and travel through in carriages and see the trees in this very precise order. But Olmsted came up with just an absolute tour de force scheme for moving through this piece of land in a way that would be both recreationally pleasant and also scientifically accurate. And his ability to do this is so deeply rooted in his earlier career as a farmer. It gave him a real appreciation for trees and how to present them. And the pathway that Olmsted designed, if you visit what's come to be known as the Arnold Arboretum today, the pathway is still pretty true to Olmsted's 19th century carriage path. It's now a walking arboretum, of course, but you can still follow it, something that's pretty true to the original pathway that Olmsted designed in the 19th century. So Olmsted had two parks underway at this point when the Boston Park Commission asked him to do an entire park system, a whole series of interrelated parks that would make use of the two parks he'd already designed, but bring others into the system as well. Olmsted was absolutely delighted. First of all, he'd been working in New York City at this point, that was where his headquarters were, and he'd been working for 25 years, and his practice in New York City pretty well dried up. Now, he had work elsewhere around the country, but in New York City, he'd done pretty much anything that he was ever going to be called upon to do. He'd done Central Park, Prospect Park, Morningside Park. He'd done private estates all over New York City and suburban Westchester and New Jersey suburbs and so forth. So he was delighted by having this whole slate of work presented to him in Boston. But the deeper reason that he was so excited about this opportunity was Olmsted had been wanting to return to Hartford, where he grew up for a while. But sadly, his father had recently died, and in the aftermath of his father's death, he engaged in just a bruising estate battle with his mother-in-law. So he perceived that he literally could not go home with him. He could not return to Hartford. But with this big slate of work offered him, he recognized he could return home to New England, to the New England of his youth. He could return home. He could go to Boston. And Olmsted, in fact, identified the neighborhood of Brookline as a neighborhood he'd like to move to. He purchased a house there that he dubbed Fairstead, and he would work in Brookline out of this house Fairstead for the rest of his life and the rest of his career and do some of his very finest work. So next he set to work creating this whole interrelated system for Boston. And Olmsted had a kind of mantra in this era. It was do the best for Boston all the time. And so he worked very hard to interconnect the two parks he'd already created with a whole series of different types of parks. For instance, he did another kind of waterway turned into a park, which is known as the Muddy River Improvement. He took a glacial kettle hole and turned it into a park, which is now known as Jamaica Park. And the final park I want to talk about in this context, as part of his park system, is Franklin Park. Franklin Park is the largest park in Olmsted's Boston park system, about 500 acres in expanse. And Olmsted took a look at the piece of land and decided literally to divide it in half. Half of Franklin Park he decided to turn into a kind of recreational area. Now, times have changed so much in the 25 years since Olmsted first designed Central Park. When Central Park was designed, it wasn't as much of a recreational society, as much as an outdoor society. And Central Park was designed to be a place of contemplation. I always picture people in that era kind of walking through with their hands behind their back, you know, thinking about some romantic poet that they favored. But 25 years on, they started working on Franklin Park. Times have changed, and so he designed this first half of Franklin Park to be a recreational area. He set aside extensive fields that were to be used for baseball and other sports. He designed a long terrace that spectators could stand on, overlook, and see the various sports being played. He designed some field houses in which athletes could do indoor calisthenics, people could change into their uniforms, and so forth. The other half of Franklin Park, Olmsted simply chose to leave pretty much as is. And this was based on a hallowed principle that Olmsted had, which was on those rare occasions when you find a piece of land that's really attractive, your job is easy, just leave it alone. With Franklin Park, he saw there were these beautiful old growth stands of hemlock and so forth. He elected to simply leave this as it is. And that decision was extremely rooted in his earlier experience of visiting Yosemite back at the tail end of the Civil War. In the aftermath of visiting Yosemite, Olmsted he donned two hats as a landscape architect. One hat was the landscape architect, really often intervening intensely in a piece of landscape, like often using a lot of gunpowder to blow up rock outcroppings, building man-made lakes and designing them, building bridges and so forth. But the other hat that he wore was as a conservationist. And sometimes when he saw a particularly attractive piece of land, he would simply argue for leaving it as is. That's what he did with this half of Franklin Park. And this was so very rooted, as I said, in his earlier experience in Yosemite. So ultimately, Olmsted cobbled together 1,100 acres of land, extending 7 miles out from downtown Boston. It came to be known as the Emerald Necklace. And I wanted to close by saying that time has been so very kind to the Emerald Necklace. It's wonderful to visit Boston and be able to see that Olmsted's vivid vision from the 19th century is still so very alive and well in the 21st century. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes. Yes, ma'am.
When did the zoo?
The zoo in Franklin Park? I don't know. Olmsted, as you might imagine, wasn't big on certain things, including zoos, but many of his parks, such as Central Park, have them. And I couldn't tell you when it wasn't part of his original design, as far as I know, but like so many kind of big multi-use spaces, people take a look and say, hey, good place for a zoo. So, like, I couldn't tell you exactly when that was designed. Yes, ma'am.
It was mentioned about his son, so can you tell us a little bit about his family life and then
Sure.
his son's?
Sure, a very volatile, strange family life. That brother who I described earlier, who he was very jealous of when he took that walking tour across England, well, that was Olmsted's beloved brother, probably the closest person he ever had in his life. And his brother died of tuberculosis, and on his deathbed, literally the P.S. on his brother's deathbed letter is, "Don't let Mary suffer while I'm alive." The very last words he wrote to Olmsted, and Mary was the brother's wife. And so Olmsted, a few years later, while he was working on Central Park, married his brother's widow and raised 3 of his brother's children as his own. But Olmsted always had a feeling too that he obviously wanted to have his own children as well, his own natural children, along with raising his brother's children. And so he had several sons die in childbirth. And so finally, pretty late in life for this era, when he was 48 years old, he had a young son that he and his wife were so nervous that this little boy would die that they simply called him Boy for the first 2 years. It was like they were afraid to even call him a name. When he was 2 years old, they finally were kind of comfortable using his christened name. And his christened name was Henry Perkins Olmsted. When he was 7 years old, when it was clear that there was some chance he might live to maturity, and then maybe, just maybe, he'd be able to follow Olmsted into the practice, they rechristened him Frederick Olmsted Jr. And as you might imagine, the pressure on this young man was unbelievable. And Olmsted would write him these letters in which he'd sort of say, in effect, in very flowery 19th century language, he'd say, "I've created a ready-made practice for you to just step into." Of course, by this time, Olmsted's in his 60s. This young man's in his late teens and in his 20s, away at college. And Olmsted would write him saying, study, study, learn, learn. You must follow me. You must pick up where I left off. At one point, his son actually wrote him a letter back in which he said, I regret that I have to say that I really feel better suited to set off on a different profession. He suggested maybe he'd become a zoologist. Instead of deflecting his father's intense attentions, that just caused an even greater onslaught of letters. And so ultimately, what happened was all this pressure on Frederick Olmsted Jr., but he did kind of relent, and he started serving various apprenticeships under Olmsted. First of all, at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, where Olmsted did the landscaping. His son was an apprentice for that project. And then on Olmsted's last great project, which was the Biltmore Estate, not only did Frederick Olmsted serve an apprenticeship, but while he was serving the apprenticeship, by now Olmsted was very old, very frail, really doing fairly badly. And William Vanderbilt, who was the client, the person who the Biltmore Estate was being designed for, he asked John Singer Sargent to paint a portrait of Olmsted. And Olmsted was so frail that he was only able to be present for 3 sittings. But his son, Frederick Olmsted Jr., who was on site acting as an apprentice, stepped in, donned his father's clothes, and if you ever see this famous portrait of Olmsted, which is at the Biltmore Estate, it's completed with Frederick Olmsted Jr. standing in for his father. And you can't make enough symbolic import to that. I mean, it was really almost like a changing of the guard. And a couple years later, Olmsted would be confined to McLean Hospital in Belmont. A few years after that, in 1903, Olmsted Sr. would die. And Frederick Olmsted Jr. really did end up stepping into his shoes, following up with his landscape architecture practice, which was ready-made. And I like to think that besides all the parental pressure which was put on him, Frederick Olmsted Jr. was also, he had a real genetic gift from his father for landscape. And he wound up doing projects all over the United States. He did a huge number of college campuses. That was a big part of the work for Frederick Olmsted Jr. He did American University in St. Louis. I believe he did the campus of Ohio State. Tons of universities. He did the Seattle Park System that I talked to someone about earlier. It's a beautiful park system. He did a lot of work out west because the geography of the country was shifting, more people moving to the west, and so a lot of Olmsted Jr.'s work was in the west. He also became much more of an urban planner than his father was. Did a lot more neighborhood work than his father had, including the neighborhood that I live in and that I talked to this lady about earlier, which is Forest Hills Gardens in Queens. So that's Olmsted Jr. Yes, ma'am.
While we're on family connections, there is, maybe even now, an Olmsted in Winchester who came and actually designed a backyard walk through forest garden for us. And he was probably a landscape architect, but it must have been several generations and generations. Do you know anything about
I
that?
don't. What I do know is, the Olmsteds and the Olmsted firm, sometimes called the Olmsted Brothers firm, were actually Frederick Olmsted Jr. and his much older brother, who was the son of Olmsted's dead brother named John Charles Olmsted. Those are really the only Olmsteds that followed into the profession. And with them, when they died, the business actually continued on because it had so much brand equity for the Olmsted firm without any Olmsteds involved, and it lasted all the way until 2000. It actually moved to Fremont, New Hampshire. But as far as I know, there are many, many Olmsted heirs, many Olmsted people who traced their lineage to Olmsted. I don't think any of them were involved in the Olmsted firm after these two brothers, but there's so many Olmsteds, it's possible that someone sort of had their own, that they got training as a landscape architect, had the famous name obviously, and maybe have the genetic bequest as well, and then slowly. But yeah, it's not someone I'm familiar with.
I should look into that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yes, sir.
What was his relationship with Charles Eliot?
Charles Eliot, I always get my Eliots confused, but I think you might be, are you talking about the president of Harvard? Is that, or?
I thought he had a business partner by the name.
That could be, I always get these confused. He had a business partner who I think if I remember right, was the son of the president of Harvard.
Grandson.
Thank you. So, yeah, that was somebody, he trained with Olmsted, then he went off on his own, if I remember correctly, and formed his own landscape architectural practice. And during if I'm remembering this correctly, during the World's Fair, Olmsted's partner, a man named Henry Codman, died. And so Olmsted was desperate to find some help. And so Charles Eliot, who had apprenticed under him earlier, had his own landscape architecture practice at the time when there weren't that many of them. He joined, and the firm I think was briefly known as Olmsted and Eliot, if I remember correctly. So that would have been the relationship there, if I'm reconstructing that probably. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the Biltmore. What time period did he design Pinehurst?
Pinehurst, I don't recognize. What is that?
It's a golfing town in North Carolina, and I know he designed the whole town at some point.
It could be. There's a town that's right by the Biltmore estate.
It's further east from Biltmore.
Huh. I have to admit, I'm not familiar with that. He designed that there because his sons came in and did an awful lot of work all over the country, often sort
It was
of.
one of his sons.
Could well be. And one thing worth mentioning here is it's kind of an, Frederick Olmsted Jr., he actually dropped the junior professionally. So it appeared, he worked until 1957. So it appeared that Central Park began in 1858. Frederick Olmsted Jr., without the junior, retired in 1957. It looks like 99 years of work by Olmsted. And an awful lot of the work, what they would actually do is often the community that had an Olmsted Senior Park would be a particularly amenable place to junior coming in and doing work. So it's possible that Pinehurst is a project on that side. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
How do you go about researching and writing a book like this? Where you're getting, detailed facts back in the 1830s?
The wonderful thing about Olmsted was because he was a journalist by training, the way I like to describe it is, if Olmsted, and it was also the 19th century, so it's just people were much more inclined to write. And so I like to describe it, if Olmsted crossed the street, Olmsted would have a diary entry about it. His friends would have diary entries about it. And Olmsted would later produce an article about his crossing of the street. So for my purposes, it created a lot of, often almost an embarrassment of riches, so many perspectives on anything he did. But he has just voluminous papers that are spread out mostly between two places, the Loeb Library at Harvard here in Boston and the Library of Congress in Washington. There are so many papers there, I'm not even sure you could get through them in a lifetime. It's an unbelievable amount of volume that he produced and also produced by his contemporaries, friends and so forth, and also because it was the times that it was, there are many of his contemporaries kept diary entries and so forth that make it possible. So it was wonderful. It was actually possible to really reconstruct a lot of what he did. The other thing that I made a decision very early on. He was involved in a huge number of projects. I decided to concentrate on the projects that I could animate through what was going on in his personal life and how that interwove with the park work. And some of his most major projects like Central Park, there was a lot of personal, private stuff going on, such as his brother died while he was working in Central Park. He later got married to his brother's wife. So the fact that there was a lot of letters describing these often very tragic events or very important events in his life that interwove with the actual park construction made it possible to kind of animate those park projects. Yes, ma'am.
Are you familiar with the book, The Devil in the White City? Have you read it?
I'm very familiar with it, great book,
My
yeah.
question is, I loved, he stood out to me in that book more than anything, and I'm wondering how true, was it, it felt like it was well researched, it was all factual, was it?
Very well researched, very true. One of the things that actually inspired me to set off on my biography was reading Devil in the White City and thinking Olmsted is, what I agree with you, I thought he kind of stole the show. So I thought, what an interesting character. And when I did my research, it's pretty, in fact, you know, Eric Larson, the author, he took the liberty of reconstructed dialogue, but in Olmsted's case, the wonderful thing is he was actually able to quote things Olmsted said in his letters, because Olmsted was, you know, could turn a pretty vivid phrase. And so all those descriptions, not only are they accurate as far as, you know, Olmsted being this, you know, exhausted man who's called upon to go to this, you know, frozen Chicago in the winter, and, you know, he's suffering from a impacted tooth and all kinds of other, not only is that accurate, but a lot of the things that he quotes, that Eric Larson quotes Olmsted as saying, he takes something that Olmsted wrote in a letter, a colorful phrase, like I'm subsisting on tea and toast. He has Olmsted say it as though he's saying it. It's from a letter Olmsted wrote to his brother, his son-in-law, John Charles. So short answer, very accurate portrayal of Olmsted at least. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the Muddy River project. Did that later become the Fenway?
No, the
Fenway area?
Muddy River Project, as far as I know, is I think it's still known by that name. Is that right? And then the Fenway, I guess, if I understand, if I've got my geography right, is just the parkways or the roadway that is by the Back Bay Fens. And Olmsted actually, he and Vaux invented the concept of the parkway. They did a park system in Buffalo in 1868. That to connect the park system, they came up with this idea of parkways, kind of beautifully designed streets that would keep you traveling through, kind of keep you in green space, keep you in park while you're traveling from park to park. And so the phrase parkway was literally coined by Olmsted and Vaux. And so when Olmsted came to work at Boston, something like the Fenway, as I understand, was his way, his parkway to connect his park system through the Fen section of the park. Any other questions?
His house in Brookline was in the news lately, but I don't know what context. I think it was being sold, and that was one of the things they described on it.
Actually, I can tell you exactly what it was. It's an elm that is over 150 years old that was standing on the grounds when Olmsted moved there and actually attracted him to this house called Fairstead. It just died, and they'd actually done a lot of genetic splicings of it. So they've got hundreds of them. They're trying to see if any of these splicings from this elm, splicings is the right word, but genetic material from this elm will actually take, and then they will replant this tree as a sapling in the same place. And the home you're referring to, it's called Fairstead, and it's a National Historic Site. It's been closed for a couple of years while they've been doing various renovations, but it's just opened back up to the public. It's an amazing place to visit because it was Olmsted's home office, so you can see how he lived, his domestic life, and also how he worked. Fairstead is at 99 Warren Street in Brookline, and it's in a really rich area because Olmsted's neighbor across the street was Charles Sprague Sargent, who founded the Arnold Arboretum, and he actually gave Olmsted as a housewarming gift. He gave him a banana, I think it's called a banana magnolia, no, pickle magnolia, that's what it is, and gave him that, and also in the same neighborhood is H.H. Richardson's house, just about, who was often Olmsted's collaborator in and around the Boston area. So Fairstead's beautiful to visit. You can also visit the surrounding homes as well. So yes, ma'am.
Is there anything interesting about the first three children? Anything that they did?
John Charles. John Charles went on to be part of the Olmsted firm, and John Charles was really, really beautiful. His father wrote him just a horrific letter, which I've included in the book, in which he said, among other things, to John Charles, "You're not a man of genius." He felt that John Charles, his son-in-law, was extremely dutiful and happy to work in the business and desperate for the approval of his, I guess it would be father-in-law, adopted father. He was a man of middling talents, but very, very dutiful and loyal. And the interesting thing was Frederick Olmsted Jr., the best I can tell, maybe it was just the fact that he was favored by the name, favored by the natural relationship. He also appears to have been like his father, kind of visionary. And when the firm formed, even though Frederick Olmsted Jr. was about 20 years younger than his half-brother, John Charles, he became the face of the firm. John Charles, as he had with his own father, kind of took a back seat, was kind of the plodding, sort of workmanlike day-to-day person. So that's one son, John Charles. That was then there was a daughter named Charlotte, and Charlotte had a family, you might call it a family susceptibility to instability, emotional instability, and so she was institutionalized for her entire adult life. The third child was a child named Owen, and Owen looked, from the time Olmsted adopted Owen looked exactly like his brother John. He was a spitting image of John, his brother who died of tuberculosis. And as Owen got older, he started to show a very frail constitution. He did the same thing that his brother John did. He tried to sort of do various adventurous things. In that era, they thought if you go outside and do some sort of bracing outdoor activities, perhaps you'll be able to overcome, susceptibility for tuberculosis. He looked more and more like his father, John. Olmsted was raising him, and as a young man, while out in Montana working on a ranch, he developed full-flung tuberculosis. Olmsted went out there to rescue him. By the time Olmsted arrived, he was already in a coma, and Olmsted was devastated, as you might imagine, because this was his beloved brother's son, who he had raised as a child, who looked just like his beloved brother, who now succumbed to the same condition. So it was another of the many tragic events in all. So those are the three children: Owen, Charlotte, who had to be institutionalized, and John Charles, the dutiful one who became part of the firm. Well, thank you.